Hi, my name is Andrew Sears, and I'm the president of City Vision University, and this is a talk that I'm recording for a workshop that I'm giving at the Gospel Rescue Mission Fellowship Conference. So the title of my talk is How to Avoid Secularization and Increase Organizational Health. I've had a strong interest in this topic of secularization and believe that this is one of the most important topics that any Christian organization can be thinking about right now. Some of my personal interest in this topic. So I grew up in Kansas City, and I, attended, conservative Baptist churches. And then whenever I went to college, I ended up going to grad school at MIT. And I remember getting a warning from my parents, saying they're gonna, make you lose your faith. And I was like, whatever, that's not going to happen. And ultimately that's what happened. I got assimilated into the dominant culture there. I left God while I was at MIT, and then God broke me and I came back to God there. And ever since then, I've been very fascinated by the drivers of secularization. So if you want to avoid this, let's study, what's causing this. And I've also had my own war wounds in kind of fighting in this battle, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. So, the starting point, obviously, on this is to look at the biblical pattern of secularization from Israel. So, Israel is just kind of a repeating cycle of Israel turns to God for help. God redeems and blesses Israel. Israel becomes complacent under blessing. Israel turns to other gods, and if the summary of the Bible is love God, love others, they stop loving God and they abuse others, and often both of those are critiqued by God. And then Israel goes into bondage, and in their case, they're taken over by other countries, and then Israel turns to God for help again. Now, I think that there's a similar pattern that happens, and one thing just to frame my expertise is, so I'm an interdisciplinary guy. So I like to look at theology, I like to look at history, I like to look at organizational studies, but my expertise is more on the history, and as an organizational expert and as an expert in observing, we've partnered with hundreds and possibly thousands of parachurch ministries. And I've seen how they've evolved, and I've seen how they've gotten pulled and gone off track. And I've studied this, at the doctoral level, master's level, and read, many, many books trying to understand this and talk to many organizations. So the pattern that I think that we're going through now in history, and one of the things to understand is, in Western Christianity, we're all about, okay, it's all about me, it's individualized Christianity. But the reality is we're a part of a larger society. And in some ways, there's a larger wave happening in Western Christianity that is affecting secularization of organizations across the board. Now, in America, there's this term that was being used called American exceptionalism. So a lot of Western culture and Western society secularized, but American culture retained a lot of its, religion. And there's this term called American exceptionalism, and now people are wondering, was America truly exceptional, or is it going to go the way of Europe? And there's an ongoing debate of that, and I think ultimately it's not a decided thing. It is, what are we going to follow the way of Israel whenever they left, or are we going to repent of the things we need to repent of? But within that, you have pressures that are being exerted on U.S. parachurch ministries. And then within that, you have pressures that are affecting your ministry. So we have to recognize that, we have these larger social issues. But the other thing about our place in history, I've read, 30, 40, 50 books around history. And, this is one of the key things I've studied. And historians agree that there's more challenges to religious freedom right now than at any other point in U.S. history. Everyone knows that there are two countries politically in the United States, and we're becoming more and more divided. That's resulting in more major denominational splits than at any other point in U.S. history, except for around the Civil War. And there's likely to be a wave of secularization of Christian institutions not seen since the wave of secularization of Christian colleges. There was a huge wave of secularization of Christian colleges. This country started, almost every college in this country started as a religious college and eventually was secularized. So, talking about the biblical pattern in recent history, so missiologist Donald McGavern coined a term, redemption and lift, and he used this term to talk about the pattern that happens in countries and people groups, and in this case, I'm going to talk about with movements and organizations. So God initiates a new movement. In his case, he was often studying countries where revival would happen. And, this country, before they followed God, they were making bad choices, and the bad choices just had natural consequences. This isn't, Old Testament God punishing people, but, once they started making, better choices, and many of you at rescue missions have seen this, once people, they stop being addicted, they get a job, they work hard, then they start to have blessings. So God redeems and blesses the country, and the movement experiences blessings and then ultimately becomes complacent. Just like happened with Israel, the organization turns to other gods, ultimately secularizing, and in many ways, the love of God and, the love of others walks away from that as the central loves. And the organization goes into bondage, and ultimately, the pattern through history is that God just creates a new movement, and that's, part of the whole new wineskin thing. So I want to talk about some case studies. So I've read a lot of different books. So on this, studying what happened with Christian colleges. So there's a book called The Soul of American University: From Protestant Establishment to Established Non-Belief. There's a book called The Secularization of the Modern American University. That was actually an article. And then Fundamentalist U. And many people are aware of what happened with Harvard. So if you look at the original Harvard logo, and I don't know Latin, but I know that what those terms mean is it was truth for Christ in the church. You can kind of, pick that up. So Veritas, people have heard that, but this is Christ, and that's the church. And then they just replace that for truth. And Harvard obviously is the big case study that everyone's heard of. A lot of people aren't as aware that Princeton was originally founded because Harvard and Yale resisted the Great Awakening. And Jonathan Edwards, who helped lead the Great Awakening, thought that Harvard and Yale were becoming too secular. So he became the president of Princeton, but ultimately Princeton went the same way as Harvard. So in many ways. So, looking at these case studies, some of the lessons that I feel like I learned from those and that, could be applied is the leadership. Almost all the secularization was led by leaders who did not think they were secularizing. Now, there are a few cases, probably less than 5% of the cases of the stories that I read, where the leaders actually were saying, what I want to do is secularize this institution. But every other case, it was 95% of people who, they were very strong Christians. They said, we're not secularizing. And they said that all the way, to the end until it was clearly secularized. One of the big other patterns is that leaders identified with mainstream culture rather than providing a prophetic criticism of it. So, in part of what I think is surprising to me is most of these institutions, if you look at their core theology at the time, it wasn't really a problem of core theology. It was a problem of organizational dynamics, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. There was funding pressure. So what happened was the government started putting 10 times, maybe even 100 times more money into organizations that would secularize. And what that did is that essentially, in other countries, they call this nationalizing, where they will nationalize the bank. And in the United States, it was a combination of state and national and federal funding. But essentially, they did kind of the equivalent of, funding wise, they made it so that you're going to be, very poor and very unfunded. And then you also had some major foundations like the Carnegie Endowment that would only fund non-sectarian institutions. And their funding was largely for a retirement program. So there's so many schools, if you read through the histories, they basically quit being Christian so that they could get a little bit better retirement packages, which to me is just sad. That's how it happened. The other thing was they said, professionalization and religious criteria were abandoned to get the best candidates. And part of the reason for that is, you're trying to get, and you can think about it now, you're trying to get the top Nobel Prize, award-winning candidate in chemistry. If you have to say, well, we're only going to take Christians, then, I don't know, there's some that are in that category, but you're going to lose a lot of your candidates. So, and then the other thing, and this is honestly the biggest, is it was just a pragmatic response to societal cultural shifts. So dramatic cultural shifts created intense pressure to secularize. Whenever only 1% of society went to college, it was okay to be Christian. But once the government started to fund higher education, so it was more like 10, 20, 30%, started to go to college, then it became much more of an issue. So you had all these situations where you had religious schools, higher education institutions in small towns, and the town was the school. So if they said no to the government money, then that meant essentially that the whole town was going to shut down. And most of the town would lose their job, and it would wreck the local economy or capitulate. So in many cases, they just said, you know what, it is what it is, so we're going to, go with it. So, but, looking at these and looking at the case studies, very few of the institutions that secularized, the only source, I wouldn't say the only source was in their theology. Now, sometimes that was, a significant root, but the fact that you had such a large number of organizations that all of a sudden changed, regardless of their theology, has to do with some of these other factors. Now, one of the cases that's often used, and there's a great book, I think it's by Peter Greer, called Mission Drift, and he uses YMCA as an example of an organization that experienced mission drift. So YMCA, whenever it was founded, it was amazing. It had evangelical-like roots. It was founded in 1844 by Sir George Williams. It had a lot of similarities to rescue missions, and it remained faithful largely to its evangelical roots until the 1950s, from everything I can read. I wasn't alive then, so I can't say firsthand, but everything I can read, that seems to be what happened. And you can see here in their initial logo, it was body, mind, and spirit, John 17:21. Similar to Harvard. And then, their logo, all of a sudden, they keep the triangle, but they lose the other elements that happen with Harvard. And one of the characters that I studied that really I think was the guy who was responsible more than anyone else for the secularization at the YMCA, and I am sad to say that, is John Mott. And John Mott was such an amazing character. In many ways, he was like the Bill Bright of his day, who, Bill Bright founded Campus Crusade. So not only was John Mott the leader of the YMCA, it wasn't that he lacked theology, because, he was the head of an organization similar to Campus Crusade, where it was called the World Student Christian Federation, where they had 3,000 schools, like InterVarsity or Crusade, and their tagline was the evangelization of the world in this generation. So this isn't a guy who shied away from evangelization, but ultimately what he did is he helped the YMCA grow tremendously, and it became essentially all things to all people. And because it was so successful, he won a Nobel Peace Prize. And it grew so much that in the 1950s and 1970s, they faced a similar situation to colleges. There was a lot of financial pressures from the growth, and with the cultural changes, they faced a choice either to secularize or shrink. And then, you can see the YMCA logo now that is just the Y, and then they have YMCA down here, and pretty soon the YMCA is going to go away, right? So, and all you're left is why. Why did they secularize, right? So, another interesting story I found out. So my wife actually worked for a university in Boston called Northeastern University. That's one of the, top 10 or 15 universities in Boston. And whenever I read its history, I didn't know this until more recently. It basically was the City Vision University of its day. It was founded out of the YMCA. It was a school founded out of YMCA. City Vision was founded out of the rescue mission movement. But what happened was it wanted to grow, and it was essentially a branch of the YMCA. It wanted to grow, and over time, it lost its Christian affiliation. And the one thing that they've retained is their practical orientation. So that's a value that City Vision has, is we have a highly practical orientation. So if you look at Northeastern, one of their distinctives is that they try to have 100% of their students go into some sort of co-op or some sort of internship placement because of their practical orientation. But the other elements of their values, they ultimately walked away from. And this is part of why I'm studying this, is how do we avoid this, with City Vision? How do we avoid this with rescue missions and other organizations? Now, a third case study that I found amazingly fascinating also is Christian radio. And I never, now you look at Christian radio and you say it's so dominated by evangelicals, but that wasn't always the case. And how it happened to me is super fascinating. So the first pioneers of Christian radio emerged in the 1920s. And in fact, a lot of the first radio stations in different parts of the country were Christians. And they were just kind of like random people who set up radio stations before there were such things. So, and then in the 1930s to 1970s, what happened was mainline denominations lobbied for free airtime for religious broadcast, and that allowed them to have early domination of airtime. Essentially, it was based on government subsidies. So they got, really premium time that was, given to them on these radio stations. And they basically lobbied to shut out evangelical groups because they said the evangelical groups are too focused on evangelism. And the evangelical group said, well, and for a long time, most radio was mainline, and the evangelical groups found ways to develop self-supporting business models. So some of the big names that now have the big schools, so Moody, Fuller, Amy McPherson from Foursquare, they were the first pioneers in this space. And they figured out how to do it without government money, and they figured out how to grow big. So what was interesting was the mainline denominations, their entire business model was dependent on the government subsidy. They locked out the evangelicals, but ultimately that became their downfall because, the way secularization happens is first society's too secular for evangelicals, then it's too secular for mainline denominations. So mainline denominations got shut out of these subsidies. And they ended, and these organizations didn't know how to raise money and to be sustainable compared to the evangelical groups. So evangelical groups dominated radio because they developed the business models, they achieved scale, they established national networks, Moody and Fuller, that's part of what they were famous for. So what are the key lessons from these case studies? Well, one of the first lessons is from Christian colleges is when social norms changed so that 95% of funding was allocated towards secular institutions, they faced a choice to either fail financially, shrink, or to secularize. And the reality is most chose to secularize. The second one is with YMCA, I think the key lesson was rapid growth created financial pressures. So the only choice to enable continued growth was to secularize. So, I think if the YMCA had grown half as quickly as they did over those decades that they grew so quickly, it would have been much easier for them to say, no to the secularization pressures. And then mainline versus evangelical Christian radio. Mainline chose government funding streams that caused them not to develop the competencies and scales that were needed for a market-driven model. Now, across all models, this is the key thing that I think is so interesting to me, is secularization process was almost always led by strong Bible-based Christians who never intended to lead a secularization process. They were just naive. Now, in a lot of cases, I feel like, so some of it has to do with theology, but as I read the stories and I hear the characters involved, and I even know, some of their theologies, I really think it's more like, being organizationally naive. So, many leaders, they may hire someone and that person may try to run a mutiny for them. Well, or a mutiny in their organization. Well, was that poor theology that caused them to hire someone who ran a mutiny? I actually think it was just naivete, organizational naivete. So in many cases, I think that that's part of what happens, is they're not thinking through these larger factors. They underestimate how funding sources and board leadership composition might drive secularization in the long term. So this last point especially, I want to talk about some more recent case studies. So this next part, I'm going to go into principles to avoid secularization from recent case studies. So if you look at this biblical pattern today, redemption and lift, where we want to zoom in on is these parts. The movement becomes complacent under a complacent organization under blessing, and then the organization turns to other gods, secularizing. Now, the number one thing that I've seen as I've read through these hundreds of case studies, really it's a tension between the quote of both Oswald Chambers and Mother Teresa. So God has not called us to success, but to faithfulness. And Mother Teresa said something similar. He said, God didn't call me to be successful; He called me to be faithful. So let me just kind of fill that out with the story of a rescue mission. So this is a rescue mission executive director that I knew very well. And he did not intend to lead a secularization effort. But what he did is he brought in a board of Christian business people, and these were evangelical Christian business people, but they all had had a lifetime of success. And the local government offered the mission a major grant that would enable tremendous growth if it would become a low barrier shelter and secularize its hiring practices. So the executive director said no, and the board fired the executive director to accommodate local government and to continue financial growth. So I want to provide a contrasting case study of what happened with TechMission. So TechMission is the parent organization of City Vision University. It was an organization that I founded, and to connect some dots, I grew up in Kansas City. I got my start at CU Mission, Kansas City, in 1992, and then later on, I went to grad school at MIT, co-founded a research group with one of the fathers of the internet, and realized my heart was for the poor. And I started an organization called TechMission around 2000. And, many people had told me, avoid government funding. And, I've always been an entrepreneur and a risk taker. So I was like, well, if it turns sour, I'll walk away from it. So we took government funding, and we were a AmeriCorps national grantee, and our budget grew rapidly. Within a few years, we were a $2 million organization. And we're an AmeriCorps national grantee for 9 years, from 2004 to 2013. Now, what happened there is in 2004, you had the Bush administration that was very supportive of faith-based organizations. And I remember people who advised me, be careful with the government funding because you can't control the direction the wind blows. And the wind blew a different direction. The Obama administration came in, and they kind of pulled in my opinion, a 1984 number where they said, oh yeah, we're going to support the faith-based administration. But they had an organized campaign to take out evangelical groups. Whenever we joined AmeriCorps, there were about 10 national grantees that were evangelical. And whenever we left, we were the last evangelical group. And the Obama administration targeted us. They put the inspector general after us. They couldn't find any problems, but it caused us so much stress that it was wrecking the emotional health of our staff. And at the end of the day, we got the Alliance Defending Freedom, or Alliance Defense Fund, it was called back then, involved. At the end of the day, the government said, we've investigated your organization. They spent 2 years essentially tearing apart our organization. And they said, we didn't find anything. And then after that, they said essentially that they were going to start over to try to find something else. And we decided to walk away from 75% of our funding is what we did. So we walked away from 75% of our funding rather than compromise our religious hiring rights. We stopped taking direct government grants. We pivoted our funding model from being 80% donor income to 80% earned income, dropping all programs. So TechMission used to have many programs, and City Vision University, whenever we took it over in 2008, it was only one of our programs, and it was only 5% of our budget. And the reality is, that sounds great. Oh yeah, what a great story. You made the right choice. Well, what that really looked like on the inside is it looked like a decade of living in the desert, a decade of significant suffering, months and months of sleepless nights, extreme pressure that all of this put on my staff. But what we did is we had to pay the price for the difficult choice. And now we have strong growth. Last year, we grew at 40%. We've been averaging 20% growth a year. And we have funding sources that have much less risk of secularization. So, contrasting these two, the rescue mission that decided to, double in size by secularizing versus TechMission, where we decided to shrink by a factor of 4 in order to remain faithful. Ultimately, what I believe the single greatest secularization threat is the God of success and respectability. So what that looks like is it looks like this. Now, if you get a board that all your board members have been in companies and their careers have looked like this, and it's up and to the right. So whatever that is, you're getting more income. If you've had your whole experience looking like this, and then you go to an organization where you're going to look bad, and the organization is going to look bad because it experiences, for a season, it experiences a decline in income. This is what I think in a lot of parts of the country, organizations are going to face. And, if you have a board and if you have executive leadership that think that this is the only way the world works and the way the world should work, and if you're not doing this, ultimately this is success. Faithfulness might look like what happened to us, where our revenue declined by a factor of 4, and it took a long time to get healthy revenue streams. And, in the middle of all that, people at the beginning of that, they said, oh yeah, you're doing all the right choices. Good job. People in the middle of that season, looked like Job's friends, and they, blamed, the challenges on the circumstances. And so, this is a challenge. So let me talk about another case study that I feel like has been a good model to follow. So InterVarsity, their context is they serve largely on secular campuses that are racially diverse and they're more left-leaning. So in terms of being on the front lines of culture wars, InterVarsity can't just choose out of this. They are on the front line of these culture wars. So they did two things in that, and basically they tried to follow biblical precedent, regardless of whether that's going to upset people. So they developed policies to clearly affirm traditional view on marriage and sexuality. But they also strongly promoted gender equality and racial equality in their leadership as a parachurch organization. And the results of that is they were banned from meeting on several leftist campuses, creating social stigma, and it significantly limited recruitment. I knew, leaders at Tufts in Boston, where it decimated their campus fellowship of, more than 100 people. And then some InterVarsity chapters at leftist campuses left InterVarsity. My wife came to Jesus through a campus InterVarsity ministry that ultimately, they were concerned they were going to essentially have to shut down the ministry if they didn't change their standards, so they changed their standards. But along the way, InterVarsity Press became a global leader on the evangelical racial dialogue and on issues around gender. So let me talk a little bit about a grid for thinking about some of these things. So there is an acculturation model, a guy named Barry. It's called Barry's acculturation model. And if you look at how are you acculturating, or are you assimilating, and what's happening with evangelicals. So he has a 2x2 grid, and is it important to develop relationships within the larger society? And he applies this in general to acculturation, but I'm applying it into the Christian context, so I've adapted it. Is it important to maintain one's identity, is what he calls it, but I'm calling it Christian identity and community. So, and you get two possibilities each way. So if it's important to develop relationships with a larger society, but it's not important to maintain your Christian community, identity and community, then you're going to assimilate. That's what secularization happens. That's what happened in these organizations. Now, in many cases, the individuals may not have assimilated, but the institutions assimilated, and that's important to recognize. And then you have biblical engagement. So you're going to retain Christian identity. You're going to retain and engage with the world. So you're going to be in the world, but not of it. And then you have this other category that Barry calls marginalization. And this is the largest group, whenever they've done studies of evangelicals, people who call themselves evangelicals, the largest growth group is people who call themselves evangelicals who do not attend church, which to me is a misnomer. I mean, I call them cultural evangelicals. So for them, what they've decided is they're just going to withdraw. The society's crazy, and I'm not going to go to church because I don't get along with them. So it's just going to be me and my family, and we're going to be spiritual at home. So that's the marginalization group. And then you have, separation. So that's fundamentalism. So you're going to retain, be very strong in your Christian faith, but you're going to withdraw from society. So obviously the quadrant we're going for here is the biblical engagement, but it's helpful to think about, what are the other options? Now, you take that concept and then you apply it to some generational trends on social issues. So I gave a talk to a group of Rescue Mission executive directors, and they talked about generational trends. And one of the slides I used was this slide. And this marketing firm studied social issue importance by generation. And they identified 3 big areas where there's generational differences: on racial equality, on gender equality, and then on sexual orientation equality. So if you look at what happened and you come back to this grid here, what does biblical engagement look like? Well, I believe what it looks like on those issues is it looks like what InterVarsity did. So they're saying, yes, we are going to lead on racial equality. We are going to lead on gender equality, but we're going to follow a biblical standard on sexual issues. And ultimately, that's I think a key factor that a lot of rescue missions will face. Now, another case study is Christian colleges currently, and this is an organization called the CCCU that most large Christian colleges, traditional Christian colleges, are a part of. So it's the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, and there's 180 evangelical members. And how it's managed cultural changes is it has 2 tiers of members. It has full voting members and affiliate members. They have stricter requirements for full voting members. CCCU has very strong programs to support women in leadership, improving the racial diversity of leadership, immigration reform. And, they've followed a path similar, I would say, to InterVarsity. Now, many of you are familiar with Seattle's Union Gospel Mission. So they went to the Supreme Court. They had a bisexual lawyer who volunteered with them in a legal clinic and later applied for a staff position. They lost a discrimination suit with Washington Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme court refused to hear the case, allowing the ruling to stand. Now, I'm still trying to find out some of the reasons why for that, because if you actually read what they said, we're not going to decide now, largely, I think, because they didn't like the particulars of the case. So I want to try to better understand the particulars of the case, because I think they are going to take a stand, coming in the future. So some specific actions to take to limit secularization, the risk of secularization. Ultimately, what we're looking to do is, okay, God blesses and redeems and blesses your movement. And how do you skip, from you're starting to become complacent? How do you repent and depend on God? So I want to talk about some steps to avoid secularization. So obviously the first one is biblical repentance and faithful dependence on God. And I think that's, can't be understated. Ultimately, it's about heart position, but it's about, having good heart position, good theology, but you also have to have, good strategy. The example I used of, you can have the right heart and you can have the right theology, but if you hire someone who's going to lead a mutineer organization, you've still made strategic mistakes. So, and a lot of these are more on the strategic side. So evaluate the composition of board and leadership. Does having success-driven board and leadership lead to secularization? I believe that's the case, and you have to be very careful there. Diversify funding streams to less risky sources. Tighten policies and the legal basis for religious hiring. I'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. Religious hiring of staff and board is absolutely critical to avoid secularization. If you don't have that, you're basically done. It's game over. You're going to secularize. It's just a matter of time. And invest in values-aligned training of staff, because this is really where I think the ones that surprise people, where people are naive, is on 2, 3, and 5. A lot of organizations have done pretty well on 4. They understand, the biblical basis, but it's these more, strategic things that I feel like can become a bigger issue. So let's look at the risk of various funding sources and support streams. So high risk of potentially losing these and low risk of losing them. And so you have government funding, that's highest risk. Then you have secular foundation and corporate grants. Then you have positive PR with local news agencies. And many of you raise a lot of money in your city, and that's something that you're dependent on. That's going to change. You're going to get a lot of negative PR over time, I think, especially if you're, in cities that are moving in directions different from traditional Christian values. Non-Christian donors not familiar with the depth of religious nature of mission. In some cities, you're going to run into local zoning cooperation with the city. Then you're going to lose wealthy and upper middle class Christian donors. And I'm talking about, ones that are more conservative right now, but they won't fund you. And then middle class and below Christian donors. Ultimately, longer term loss of tax exempt status could be at risk. I think even safer than that is earned income. That's part of why City Vision has decided to focus a lot on earned income. Church-based donations from more conservative organizations are going to be secure. If you are a church and you're getting tithe, then that's going to be a vehicle. And it's worth recognizing that there's a lot of countries where the 501c3 status doesn't exist for Christian organizations. But there's also countries where you're not allowed to be a Christian organization. So in terms of things you can do to avoid secularization, item 4 that I listed was tighten up your legal and policy things. The organization that is basically best in the world on this is the Alliance Defending Freedom. As I mentioned, in our history, whenever we faced this crisis, it was back whenever it was called the Alliance Defense Fund. They were critical. They now have a really good program called the ADF Ministry Alliance. And, it's very affordable for a lot of organizations that are members of ECFA. I would say this is an add-on that provides something similar, but helps protect you. ECFA helps you around financial standards. This is a group that essentially helps you around secularization standards. And if you get in legal trouble, they'll help you out. So their recommendations that they have is they say have the following statements: a statement of faith, a statement on marriage and sexuality, a statement on the sanctity of human life, a statement on the final authority on matters of faith and conduct, and they provide details of these: a religious mission statement and a code of Christian conduct, and have the following policies and procedures. So use religious employment criteria, have a signed statement of faith from people, have a religious job description. There's particularities of how, making sure that, as an example, that staff members can be required to lead a chapel, is a very explicitly religious statement. Because if you just have someone who's a janitor and there's nothing at all about their job description, that's ultimately what happened in the Seattle's Union Gospel Mission, is they argued there wasn't anything religious about this. A facility use policy, and emphasizing religious character throughout the organization. So early on, World Vision, before they went to the Supreme Court, they faced some smaller challenges, and there was concerns around, was it pervasive through their whole organization? And they updated everything so it was clear everywhere in their organization that they're a Christian organization. So I want to just conclude on, I told you that this is a passion that I have. So I helped architect and am the primary architect of our curriculum. So what I want to talk about is how we can help your organization increase values alignment to avoid secularization. So what we do, so we're extremely targeted in terms of what we do. We provide practical education for Christians serving the poor and the addicted. So we're going to be much more relevant. So you might get Christian that they got a Bible degree, but we're going to help them. It's going to be very applicable for how to use this in your ministry. So like other Christian institutions, we have deep Christian integration. We help translate tools into a Christian context. One of our taglines is we help you professionalize without compromising your values. Another thing that makes us unique is we focus on partnerships with Christian nonprofits. We've had organizations that have sent us 40 staff. A quarter of all their staff have been City Vision students. And part of the way we can do that is we're extremely affordable. So compared to other schools, we cost less than half, and in some cases, we're like 25%. We provide really good prior learning credit. So the point is, rather than, say you're at a rescue mission that has 160 staff, the traditional way to think about education is you might have anywhere from 1 to 4 staff that might attend a Christian institution in any given year. That's not going to be enough to offset the secularization. What we do is we're providing tools that can help influence your whole organization or large pools of your organization. Now, one of the grids we use for this is this tool called Competing Values Framework. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but it breaks up your organization culture into how internally focused are you, how externally, how flexible are you, how stable. Flexible could be kind of like Myers-Briggs P. This would be like Myers-Briggs J if you're familiar with Myers-Briggs. And ultimately, as an organization, you're trying to balance between being not of the world and sent into the world, or some people like to use the term the church gathered and the church scattered. And then balancing cultural relevance with being faithful to Scripture. And what you have is you have different groups, and we call them the ministry mindset. And if you get too many ministry people together, they all have their Bible degrees, then you can start to have this insular holy huddle thing. And ministry people often don't know how to get access to resources. And why it's called competing values is often there's a competition between these two sides. So there's the ministry people where the whole thing's about heart. You people who care about fundraising, you're just not biblical. And then there's the business people who just think that, this ministry people are just not sophisticated enough, and ultimately everything's driven by money. If you get too imbalanced across either of these dimensions, you can either not have enough money and then you become dysfunctional, or you become a culture of it's just business. Then over here, the control, this is, risk avoidance, and it's, a lot of your HR policies, a lot of your accounting policies. But whenever you come into, if you get your entire ministry that, your theology gets run by accountants, then that kind of becomes, legalism, judgmentalism, can be fundamentalism. And then over here, so I'm an entrepreneur, and, a lot of these organizations that are young and they're starting off, they're like, we don't do policies. And then they have issues around, sexual abuse or misconduct. They get lawsuits or government investigations. They get secularized from the new. I was a part of a church plant that was very focused on everything new. And it was evangelical whenever it was cool to be evangelical, but then whenever it wasn't, they secularized. So ultimately, you're trying to balance these quadrants. And what you're trying to avoid is where you get too much in one area or too much cultural distance. So there's some ministries I've seen that all the people are all heart, no business, or all business or no heart. And then what happens is because you can't communicate between the two, one side leaves and then you become dysfunctional. So what often happens is the ministry people leave. And this is what I see happening. This is probably the big trend that I see happening right now in rescue missions, is because they're professionalizing. The people, these ministry people are leaving. They're saying it's just about a business. Your growth curve looks like this, but the people who, were the heart of the ministry are gone. So ultimately, what we're trying to do in our education is create bilingual fluency. So let me talk about what that looks like. So whenever we design our ministry and management degrees, we're trying to design across all 4 of these competencies. And what that looks like, you can see, okay, you got fundraising, grant writing, nonprofit marketing, business skills over here. Then over here, you have things like cross-cultural management. So if you hire a business person, the first course I'd recommend that they take, you might want to get them, first course, you might want to have them do fundraising if that's what they're doing. But maybe the second course would be cross-cultural management and ministry, because that's going to help them translate their business concepts into your context. And there's a lot of other, courses. We have our Bible and theology courses that can be helpful, because a lot of times you'll hire outside people who are amazing professionals, but they may not have the Bible and theology that's going to keep you from secularizing. And then we have, the operations courses, the accounting and, detail-oriented courses, and then the entrepreneurial courses. And ultimately, you integrate that through strategic management. And what we're trying to do in organizations, so this gets into the last part of the talk where I said, health. What health looks like is it looks like being strong in all of these dimensions, finding the right balance for your organization. And this is part of how we help you do that. So that's our passion. I have, I told you one of my personal passions is to help organizations avoid secularization. I put that in as many of our courses as we can. So if you're, in our executive leadership and board development, I have, sessions on that. And strategic management, I have sessions on that. On our organizational behavior, which is about organizational health, I have sessions on that. And so, that becomes a central theme. And ultimately, what you need to do is, as you grow your organization, you have to retain balance and, do a lot of these best practices that I've recommended. So if you find this helpful, please, connect with us. We'd love to help you in trying to keep your organization from secularizing. So thanks a lot.